Welcome to Peterborough, today the largest city in the modern county of Cambridgeshire, and one of England's more surprising homes of enthralling history. Though better known today as one of the country's new towns, developed substantially in the 1960s, Peterborough is a city with over 1,000 years of history, including a magnificent medieval cathedral, the burial place of Mary Queen of Scots, and much more. And so amid the modern buildings and wide-open city streets, you'll find an array of captivating historic landmarks. On this walk around the city centre on a frigid morning, we'll dive into Peterborough's illustrious past, and its most famous sites, while also taking a glimpse of a city today at a turning point in its history. But we start at the heart of Peterborough, with the parish church of St John the Baptist, which has stood here for over 600 years. Interestingly, however, while construction work on this church began in the year 1402, it was mostly carried out by relocating the old 12th century parish church, located a few minutes' walk to the east of here, stone by stone. As such, the oldest parts of the church at the heart of Peterborough today date from as long as 900 years ago, and its tower was once topped by a soaring spire, although that was removed on safety grounds in the 1820s, and a series of successive restorations to the building afterwards mean that much of the church as we see it today features rather newer stonework. That being said, it's lucky that this church stands in any form today, as back in the year 1651, at the end of the English Civil War, plans were made by Parliament to fully demolish the church and use its stones to repair the cathedral and to build a workhouse in the centre of the city. But for whatever reason, the demolition never went through. A few years on from that near miss, this building was erected just next door to the parish church. This is Peterborough's Guildhall, an important civic building that was completed in 1671, replacing an older medieval Guildhall that stood just a few steps away, and designed in elegant style to celebrate the restoration of King Charles II and the monarchy after the 11 years of Republican Commonwealth at the end of the Civil War. And in a central position on the front of the Guildhall here, you can see the symbol of the royal arms of King Charles II himself, accompanied by a quartet of shields related to important local figures from the mid-17th century. The building's upper floor was used as meeting chambers for Peterborough's council from its inception until 1933, when the new, much larger town hall was built on Bridge Street. But the site of the Guildhall here at the centre of Peterborough has been a place of significance for even longer than the building has stood, as in the medieval era there stood a buttercross on the same site, marking where dairy markets in Peterborough were once held. In fact, this central city square, known as Cathedral Square, was once upon a time a vital centre of trade in the local region, with market stalls packing the centre of Peterborough, selling goods of all sorts. Nowadays, markets are still held on Cathedral Square, albeit somewhat less frequently, with special farmers' markets and other trade events hosted a few times each month on the city's main plaza. Of course, Cathedral Square takes its name from its proximity to the spectacular Peterborough Cathedral, which stands within a close behind this impressive castle-style gateway, known as the Norman Gate, which was built between the years 1177 and 1194, and stood beside a former chapel dedicated to the then recently murdered Thomas Becket, which was positioned roughly where the white building to our side is today. Now, the Norman Gate's imposing appearance was no accidental design. It separated the cathedral and abbey close from the marketplace, where civilians lived and worked. That's why the parish church of St John the Baptist was built, despite being so close to the cathedral, as it was used for worship by civilians, and the cathedral, at that time an abbey church, was initially for the use of monks. In fact, despite being one of the grandest and finest Norman-era churches built in England by the time it was completed in the year 1238, the abbey church wouldn't gain the status of cathedral until over 3 centuries later in 1541. Now finding ourselves within the historic cathedral close, the spectacular building is essentially the same today as it was upon completion back in 1238, standing as one of the most impressive church buildings in Britain today. But why was Peterborough Cathedral built to such grandeur? Well, about 600 years before this building was completed, a small monastery was founded on this site, by a man named Peter, the son of the king of the medieval kingdom of Mercia. The monastery stood for around 200 years, before being destroyed by the infamous Great Heathen Army of the Vikings, who had invaded East Anglia in the year 870 AD. A century afterwards, the monastery here was refounded, but it and much of the town of Peterborough was destroyed in a fire in the year 1116. 2 years later, the cathedral we know today began construction, designed to be a spectacular new church that demonstrated the wealth of Peterborough's community of monks, which had become renowned across England over the previous centuries. During its time as an abbey church, the leader of the monks, the abbot, was resident in the heart of this close, inside what were once the abbot's lodgings, built in the 13th century. But once Peterborough's abbey church became a cathedral in 1541, closed down by order of King Henry VIII during his dissolution of the monastery's campaign, the abbot's lodgings, located inside the impressive gateway over to our right, were converted into the Grand Bishop's Palace, serving as the residence of the Bishop of Peterborough. But the abbey church was associated with King Henry VIII for more than just his role in closing it down. Back in 1536, it became the burial place of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, whose grave can still be found inside Peterborough Cathedral today. What's more, just 51 years after the burial of Catherine of Aragon here, Peterborough Cathedral was also the site of the funeral and burial of Mary, Queen of Scots, who had been executed at nearby Fotheringhay Castle after 19 years of captivity under the order of Queen Elizabeth I. Now, while Elizabeth had long suspected the Scottish Queen of plotting against her, she had been reluctant to order her execution, given that she was both a fellow sovereign and her own cousin. As such, when it appears that the guards of Fotheringhay Castle went against the Queen's orders and executed Mary, Elizabeth ordered that Mary at least receive a grand funeral here in Peterborough, although Mary was buried against her own wishes in a Protestant ceremony. Peterborough Cathedral played host to the tomb of Mary Queen of Scots for 25 years, before it was removed by her son and by then King of England, James I, who took it to Westminster Abbey in London. The site of Mary's old tomb is still clearly displayed inside Peterborough Cathedral today, although the actual tomb itself was destroyed in 1643 by the parliamentarian forces of Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War. Making our way out of the cathedral close now, Peterborough Cathedral was devastated by the impact of the Civil War. Having started out in the conflict as a city with royalist sympathies, the parliamentarians took control of Peterborough in 1643, and perhaps in vengeance for its royalist leanings, ransacked much of the cathedral's interior. Later on in the war, King Charles I spent a couple of nights imprisoned here in Peterborough by the parliamentarians. But given Peterborough's treatment by Cromwell's armies, it's no wonder that the local people wanted to build the Grand Guildhall in celebration of the monarchy's return in 1660. The damage caused in Peterborough by the impact of the war wasn't fully repaired until the early 19th century. But why was this city so heavily affected? Well, as you can see from this map, Peterborough, located about 35 miles north of Cambridge and just 15 miles southeast of the historic town of Stamford, lies somewhat on the border between the region of East Anglia and England's East Midlands. At the outbreak of the Civil War, this location put Peterborough right on the border between major royalist strongholds like Stamford and East Anglia, a major parliamentarian stronghold that included the location of the headquarters of the Eastern Counties Association in Cambridge, home to the most important armed force of the parliamentarians' war effort early on in the conflict. As such, Peterborough was right in the crosshairs of battle, and it was devastated by the eventual victory of the parliamentarians, never really managing to recover its status as a major regional centre. In fact, The century following the Civil War wasn't kind to Peterborough, suffering with severe housing and sanitation issues for decades, although by the late 18th century, almshouses and workhouses for the city's poor were established at the outset of a rebound to economic prowess. Here on City Road, meanwhile, we're looking up at Peterscourt, a grand building of 1859 designed by the famous architect George Gilbert Scott, and which originally served as a teacher training college until 1938, though now it's used as offices. Directly opposite Peterscourt, meanwhile, there stands a slightly later building of 1873, originally built as a courthouse that operated until 1986. Among residents of Peterborough today, however, it's probably best known as the home of the former Fifth Avenue nightclub, which operated from 1988 until 2002. Ever since 2002, the building has lay empty, though now work is underway to convert it into modern housing. Now this part of Peterborough, located just to the north of the Cathedral Close, is an area that's undergone much change through recent decades. Just along from the old courthouse is the site of the City Market, where most of the stalls that would have once occupied Cathedral Square are now in operation all year long. Meanwhile, near to where the City Market stands today, was the site of Peterborough's old Embassy Theatre, a huge 1930s theatre where acts such as Laurel and Hardy and the Beatles played, although the Fab Four were yet to hit the big time when they played here in Peterborough, and are said not to have actually been all too well received by the audience here. Now as we walk back down City Road to make our way back towards the very heart of Peterborough, you'll notice that the vast majority of the buildings that surround us are creations of the last 60 years or so. That's because, while this area of the modern city too was a part of the medieval town, Peterborough was dramatically redeveloped from the late 1960s onwards, when it was designated by the government as a so-called new town. New towns were a scheme that developed in the aftermath of the Second World War, when Britain was hit by chronic housing shortages, with many Londoners left homeless after their houses had been destroyed during the Blitz. Initially, the first wave of new town development in the late 1940s was focused on the immediate surrounding area of London, but by the 1960s, as the population of the capital grew and its suburbs began to swell, more new towns were needed to provide new housing and accommodate an overspill of London's population. In 1967, Peterborough, located about 75 miles north of the capital, was designated as one of 3 new towns to serve this purpose for London, alongside Milton Keynes and Northampton. And so, there began an era of drastic urban development to modernise Peterborough. At the time of its new town designation, Peterborough was already a decently sized settlement of about 80,000 people, but the Development Corporation aimed to double this to a population of around 160,000, with new suburbs built surrounding the city centre, and huge modern facilities like the expansive Queensgate shopping centre open to cater to this newly increased population. Today, Peterborough's population continues to expand, sitting at over 200,000 and starring as one of the cities with the fastest population growth in Britain today. That's why the city is made up of so much late 20th century architecture that lines noticeably wide streets, although the grid-style layout that the city centre here is built on wasn't actually a creation of the 1960s. In fact, while the areas surrounding Peterborough city centre have been substantially redeveloped, the plan of these streets was actually a creation of the monks of the old abbey. Back in the year 1150, the abbot designated the creation of a new market area just outside the Close, today the site of Cathedral Square, while streets like Long Causeway here were laid out to serve as a home for commerce in the medieval town, almost serving as a kind of new town of its day. And they say history doesn't repeat itself. But while the development of Peterborough in the medieval era surprisingly closely mirrors its development in the last few decades, the city has been through plenty more over its centuries of history, most notably having undergone a period of striking industrial development in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Early on in the 18th century, Peterborough, with its cathedral, was the smallest city in England, home to no more than 3,000 people, but the onset of the Industrial Revolution caused a spark. Historically, a number of people in Peterborough made a living off the traditional industry of clay pipe making, as the city lies on top of vast deposits of clay beneath the ground. In the 19th century, however, with a building boom across the country, Peterborough soon found itself as one of the foremost producers of bricks, an industry which it led for the best part of 100 years and which still takes place here today. Along with a variety of other heavy industries including iron production and, by the early 20th century, engineering and the manufacture of heavy machinery, Peterborough found itself as a major industrial centre in the east of England, while the railways, in the form of the newly built line running between London and York, arrived in 1845. For now, though, we've returned to Cathedral Square, and on this side of the parish church, we're looking at a block of former almshouses, built for the city's poor between 1835 and 1903, and which stood beside both the busy marketplace and an area of small-scale medieval industry. The small street here leading in towards the Queensgate shopping centre is known as Cumbergate, which is thought to mean Street of the Woolcombers. Woolcombing, the practice of preparing wool fibres for spinning and weaving, may have taken place on this street as far back as the 13th century. Almost every trace of civilian buildings in medieval Peterborough is long since gone, but here on Cumbergate we can see a historic timber-framed building that was built in the late 15th century. Once upon a time, pretty much every building in Peterborough would have looked like this, but with the impacts of conflicts and fires over the centuries, as well as the sweeping redevelopment of the city in the 19th and 20th centuries, there are now just 2 major timber-framed buildings left in Peterborough. Now, of course, while the timber-framed buildings and churches of medieval Peterborough would have looked rather pretty on a postcard, the city wasn't always the best place to live. As we mentioned, the devastating aftermath of the Civil War affected Peterborough badly, and throughout the 18th century, the city suffered with severe sanitation issues which actually persisted as the population increased in the 19th century. However, the long-standing sanitation problems in Peterborough and its consequential effect on the easy spread of diseases like typhoid were finally put to an end by an engineer by the name of John Addy, who had an office roughly where the Queen's Head pub is in front of us today. Addy designed and commissioned the first public water supply and drainage systems in Peterborough, which were laid out in the 1870s, and this finally brought about a clean and sufficient supply of water to the city, whose population had far outstripped its facilities of just a few decades beforehand. Now, as we mentioned, one of the big developments in the 19th century that contributed to Peterborough's rise in population and industrial prowess was the arrival of the railways in 1845, but it nearly didn't happen at all. As we walk down the narrow cross street, the original plans of the Great Northern Railway, who were building the line from London to York, intended for trains to stop at nearby Stamford, bypassing the then less than significant city of Peterborough altogether. However, the plan was blocked by the politician the Lord Exeter, and so in a need to have a stop at some place between London and the major railway depot at Doncaster, it was decided that trains would pass through Peterborough instead. This was a huge development for the burgeoning city, as its growing industry now had an outlet to transport its goods nationwide on one of the country's most important railway lines, which would later become the East Coast Main Line between London and Edinburgh. Now, here at the end of Cross Street, we find ourselves looking up at a former Congregational church that was fashioned from an old Georgian-era townhouse in the mid-19th century, hence the building's rather unusual but still gorgeous appearance. On this street, known as Priestgate, you'll find a few more examples of austere Georgian architecture, showing another side to the long history of Peterborough city centre, which you can certainly learn about in great detail in the large building here. This is Peterborough Museum and Art Gallery. Originally, the building was a private mansion built back in 1816, but which later went on to be used as the city's first hospital in 1857, and then, in the 20th century, a museum and art gallery, housing everything from fossils found in the local area to medieval relics and the original manuscripts of the acclaimed 19th century poet John Clare, born just on the outskirts of Peterborough and who was known as the Northamptonshire peasant poet for his working class upbringing on a farm, and for the fact that, until 1974, the area around Peterborough was a part of the county of Northamptonshire. Now John Clare, who was actually from the nearby village of Helpston, was acclaimed for his portrayal of the traditional English countryside amid a period of widespread industrialisation, and Peterborough was a clear example of that during his lifetime. But of course, before the growth of heavy industry, Peterborough was still significant on account of its market, to which traders from all over the region would travel. As a result of the market status, a wealthy merchant class began to emerge in Peterborough, and one member of that burgeoning class was the Hake family, who lived in this historic house on Priestgate in the late 16th century. Of course, the reason for the emergence of this merchant class during this specific period was that the abbey, whose abbot and monks had previously dominated Peterborough's economy and commerce, had been dissolved by Henry VIII, and so many were able to capitalise on this effective gap in the market. But the mark of the abbey's monks still holds strong today, not only in the form of the cathedral close and the city's street layout as we mentioned, but also in the form of important infrastructure that was built to improve the city's links with the outside world, such as an important bridge over the River Nene, which we'll visit at the end of our walk in just under 10 minutes' time. Now, speaking of the area outside central Peterborough, there's one locally known, but otherwise generally unknown site that made history around 230 years ago. A couple of miles to the south of Peterborough, there once stood the Norman Cross Prison, built in 1797 to hold French prisoners of war during the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. Now, there were already a number of places all over England which were used to hold French POWs during the conflicts. But what's notable about the Norman Cross prison outside Peterborough is that it was specifically designed for the purpose, and as such is believed to have been the world's first purpose-built prisoner of war camp. Now, as many as 1,770 prisoners are thought to have died at the camp before it was demolished in 1816, but most were as a result of disease, and in fact, the POWs at the Norman Cross actually had a fair degree of autonomy. Most importantly, they were allowed to ply whatever trades they had been trained in at home, and were permitted to sell their wares at Peterborough's market, creating a surprising diversity of products on sale here in the first few years of the 19th century. And the city's museum still has some of those products made and sold by French POWs here on display. But having now made our way out of Priestgate, on clear display here on the wide open Bridge Street is Peterborough's mighty Town Hall, built in 1933 and which served to replace the comparatively tiny Guildhall on Cathedral Square that we saw at the start of our walk. Of course, by the point that the Town Hall was built, Peterborough had grown to have a population that was nearly 30 times larger, and down in front of the Town Hall on Bridge Street there stands this memorial erected in 2012, dedicated to the members of Peterborough's population who've lost their lives in conflicts around the world. The new War Memorial was built here as the city's original monument was built in a relatively hidden position behind the cathedral, and as such, many remembrance services now take place here on Bridge Street in front of the Town Hall. Now, the impressive Town Hall, a symbol of how Peterborough rose to prominence as a result of the Industrial Revolution, towers over the wide-open Bridge Street, which serves as one of the most important shopping streets in the city centre today. A huge pedestrian promenade that takes its name from the bridge that we'll visit at the end of our walk, Bridge Street was actually once, almost unbelievably, known as Narrow Street. And as that name suggests, the street was really rather narrow, measuring only 15 feet across, as it had done for centuries, before most of its buildings were demolished in the late 20th century as part of the new town development plans. As we mentioned, the objective of developers from the 1960s onwards was to double Peterborough's population, and in order to achieve this, not only was it necessary to build new, larger buildings to house shops, offices and such for the large amount of newcomers to the city, but a number of new suburbs surrounding central Peterborough were also constructed, which surround the city today. As such, Peterborough has gone from being one of the smallest cities in the country at the turn of the 19th century to the 48th largest urban area in the UK today, with a larger population and urban sprawl than places like York, Colchester, and its neighbour Cambridge. Of course, the city was designed so that the centre here would still serve as the focal point for all people living in the suburbs, complete with offices to which people commute, and major shopping destinations too. We mentioned the Queensgate shopping centre, which was opened in 1982, but there are also 2 more malls to be found in Peterborough. In 1964, the Hereward Cross shopping centre was opened just before the new town designation, while in 1989 here on Bridge Street, the Rivergate shopping centre was opened, which plays host to a number of more independent retailers compared to the big names you'll find in Queensgate. Now, as we're passing by the Rivergate here, I have to make a slight apology for not turning the camera around. Perhaps I was too engrossed by the history of shopping centres in Peterborough. Just out in front of the entrance to the Rivergate shopping centre, you'll find this monument of a large bell. It's meant to depict the cathedral's clock bell in its mould during the process of being cast, and it pays tribute to a local iron founder by the name of Henry Penn, who cast bells for churches and houses around the turn of the 17th century. Just off Bridge Street here was once the site of a busy iron foundry, which was just one arm of Peterborough's growing industrial profile in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. But as we mentioned, given the clay deposits beneath the ground here, it was brickmaking that eventually rose to become the most important local industry in town. Brickmaking and heavy industry eventually came to take a back foot in Peterborough from the 1970s onwards, but in tandem with its new town development, Peterborough became an attractive, modern home for many service sector companies to set up their offices, and the city today still retains many of those major companies. The very centre of Peterborough, despite only having been reconfigured just a few decades ago from its original appearance, underwent a major refurbishment between 2006 and 2012, further boosting development in the city. And later this year, in 2022, the city will also become home to a brand new university, known as ARU Peterborough. So as I hope you'll agree from all that we've seen on this walk, Peterborough is a city that's still changing at the moment, but with a fast-growing population and regular new developments, its prospects are certainly strong for the future. Having made our way all the way along Bridge Street now, we find ourselves approaching the River Nene, the effective boundary of the city centre today. In a moment, we'll get a look at the river and the historic bridge which crosses it. But here, we're passing by an old building amid a sea of modern roads. Dating from the 18th century, this was once the city's customs house, which served as a storehouse for products being brought into Peterborough until their duties were paid. But Peterborough lies about 30 miles inland, so how were boats coming to import goods into the city? Well, historically, ships were able to navigate the River Nene here all the way from the sea, through the port of Wisbech and towards the western perimeter of Peterborough. Wisbech, as it is today, was a more significant port than Peterborough, but this city still saw a degree of commercial activity passing along the River Nene, which, at 100 miles in length, is the 10th longest river in the UK today. Riverborne commerce is no longer too common in Peterborough, but the Nene here is crossed by the historic town bridge, today an impressive iron river crossing of 1872, but which occupies the site of the original wooden bridge across the river built by the abbey monks all the way back in 1308. And here by the riverside, it's as if we've come full circle with our trip through the history of Peterborough, a far more fascinating city than many people may expect on first glance. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to visiting Peterborough for yourself, sometime in the future too.